miles away from the designated parking areas. The plan was pretty simple. I was going to hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near this small creek that I'd spotted on a map, and just chill for a couple of nights. The hike-in was uneventful. It was a beautiful day. The sun was cutting through the pine trees and the air had that crisp, clean smell that you only get when you're deep in the forest. I reached the camping spot I'd picked out at around 4 in the afternoon, and it was perfect. Flat ground, close to the water, and surrounded by these thick brushes that acted like a natural windbreaker. I set up my tent and began to gather some firewood. As I was scavenging for these dry branches, I found myself a little farther away from my site than I'd intended to go, and found something that gave me this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was a pile of dirty, wet clothes, half stuffed under a fallen log, a flannel shirt, some torn jeans, and a single boot. They looked like they'd been there for months, maybe even years, covered in moss and dirt. I remember standing there just staring at it, my brain trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I told myself that maybe some hiker had dumped their gear because it got too heavy, or maybe there was just some trash left behind by some teenagers, but deep down, it all felt really wrong and out of place. So I went back to my campsite and tried to shake off the creepiness feeling. I got a fire going and made some dinner. As the sun went down, the woods got dark, and I mean pitch black. The canopy was so thick that even the moonlight couldn't really get through. I sat by the fire for a few hours just listening to the crackling wood and the flowing creek. At around 10 o'clock, I decided to turn in for the night. I doused the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and zipped up the tent. I usually fall asleep pretty quickly, but that night I was tossing and turning. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, my mind just went back to that pile of clothes. I must have eventually drifted off because I woke up abruptly to the sound of crunching, like boots pressing down on dry pine needles. I knew it wasn't an animal, like a deer or whatever. These crunching steps, they seemed to be way too deliberate and methodical, and they were coming from about, I'd estimate, maybe 20 feet away from my tent at this point. I stopped breathing, straining my ears to listen. Then the footsteps stopped. I laid there for what felt like an hour. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. Then I heard a voice. It was a low, raspy, humming sound, like it wasn't a song, just a single monotone note being hummed by a man or what sounded like a man, and it was coming from right behind my tent now. Slowly, I reached for the hunting knife I kept in the side pocket of the tent. I gripped the handle so tight my knuckles hurt. I waited for him to say something or to try to open the tent, but he just kept humming that same note. After a few minutes, the humming stopped. Then came the sound that made me almost jump out of my skin. It was the sound of a hand sliding down the nylon fabric of the tent. I could see the indentation of a hand pressing against the wall of the tent, backlit by the very faint moonlight. I yelled out, shouted as loud as I could, demanding to know who was out there and warning them that I was armed, and got silence, complete, dead, utter silence in response. I expected to hear maybe footsteps running away or maybe a threat shouted back, but there was nothing. The hand moved away from the fabric, but I didn't hear him walk away, and that was the worst part. I knew he was still standing there, just inches away from me, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. I sat there, clutching my knife, pointing it at the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there, shaking, waiting for the zipper to move. When the sun finally started to come up, gray light started to filter into the tent. I waited until I could hear birds chirping before I slowly unzipped the door, knife ready, and peeked out. The campsite was empty. But then I looked at the ground around my tent, and there were these boot prints, not just a few. The dirt around my tent was trampled flat, like he hadn't just stood there, he had circled the tent over and over and over again. There must have been hundreds of footprints creating this perfect ring around my tent. I didn't even bother packing up. I just grabbed my keys, my wallet, and the knife, and I bolted. I left everything else behind, the sleeping bag, the cooking gear, the tent itself. I just ran. I sprinted that 5-mile hike in probably less than an hour, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced I was going to see a man in one boot chasing after me. When I finally got to my car, I fumbled the keys, dropped them, picked them up, and practically dove into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and started the engine. As I was backing out, I looked toward the tree line where the trail emerged. I didn't see anyone, but I did see something that made me go cold inside. Tied to a tree, right at the edge of the parking lot, was my blue flannel shirt. the one that I had packed inside my backpack, which should have been left back at my tent 5 miles away. Instead, it's here, just wrapped around this tree. I reported it to the rangers, and they went out to check the site. They told me they found my tent slashed to ribbons, but they never found the guy. I still go camping sometimes with my friends, but I never go alone anymore. And I always check the perimeter before I set up camp, because the thought of that guy circling my tent all night, humming, knowing he could have come in at any time, well, it still keeps me up at night. This happened on a road trip I took back in college, and honestly, it scared me more than anything I've ever encountered in the woods. It's the reason I refuse to drive alone at night through rural areas anymore. I was driving home for spring break. It's usually about an 8-hour drive from my campus to my parents' house, mostly on major interstates. But there was this massive construction project going on that was causing miles of backup, so my GPS suggested a detour. It was supposed to save me an hour by cutting through these back roads in southern Ohio. So at the time, it seemed like a good idea. I mean, I just wanted to get home at the end of the day. So I got off the highway around 11 p.m. and started heading down these 2-lane blacktop roads. At first, it wasn't too bad. There were a few houses here and there, but after about 20 miles, it was just cornfields and patches of thick woods. There were no streetlights, no cell service even, just total darkness beyond where my headlights hit. I hadn't seen another car in miles. After a while, I was starting to feel my eyes getting heavy, so I decided I needed to stretch my legs, maybe grab a soda. So I saw a sign for a gas station about a mile ahead, and I pulled off. It was one of those super old stations, the one that looked like they haven't been updated since the 70s. There was this one pump that still had the manual numbered dials, and the main building was dimly lit. There was an older beat-up pickup truck parked off to the side near the air pump, but nobody was around it. I went inside. The bell above the door jingled loud in the quiet night. The clerk was this older guy, maybe in his 60s, just sitting behind the counter reading a newspaper. He didn't even look up when I walked in. I grabbed a Mountain Dew and a bag of chips and brought them to the counter, but as I was paying, I got this weird prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. So I glanced out the front window, and there's someone standing by my car. It was a guy in a dark hoodie just standing right next to my driver's side door, looking down into my window. I quickly finished paying and walked out, heading toward my car, trying to act confident, jingling my keys. As I got closer, the guy by my car slowly looked up. He was gaunt, with sunken eyes that looked way too intense. He didn't move away from my door. I stopped about 10 feet away and asked him if he needed something, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't say anything for a very long, uncomfortable moment. He just stared at me. Then he pointed toward my rear tire and said that my tire looked low. His voice was scratchy, like he hadn't used it in days. I looked at the tire and it looked perfectly fine. I knew right then that this was some kind of a setup. I told him thanks and that I'd check it later. I unlocked the car, stepped around him quickly, and got into the driver's seat. As I was pulling the door shut, he grabs the handle. I look up at his face, and the intensity of his expression sent a chill through me. I yanked the door closed with everything I had, locking it instantly. He just stood there, his hand still on the handle, tapping the glass with his other hand. It's interesting, the things you remember in times of stress, but I could swear I never saw him blink. I put the car into reverse and spun out of the lot and floored it as soon as I was back onto the main road. I was shaking so bad I could barely keep the car straight. I kept checking my rearview mirror every 2 seconds, and for the first 5 minutes there was nothing, just blackness. I started to calm down a little, telling myself it was just some local weirdo trying to scare a college kid. Then I saw the headlights, way behind me. They were moving fast, way faster than I was going, and I was already doing 80. Within a minute, they were right on my bumper. It was the old beat-up pickup truck from the gas station. I sped up, and he sped up. I slowed down, thinking maybe he'd pass, and he just stayed right there, blinding me with his high beams. This went on for 10 miles. My phone still had 0 bars. I was completely alone out there with this maniac. Suddenly, he swung out into the oncoming lane and pulled up right alongside me. I looked over, and there was the guy in the hoodie driving, and he was smiling. A wide, completely unhinged smile. He started drifting into my lane, trying to run me off the road. I laid on my horn and jerked the wheel to the right, my tires spitting gravel onto the shoulder. I was terrified of flipping into the ditch. I slammed on the brakes, letting him shoot past me. Then I saw a green sign ahead for an interstate entrance ramp and I gunned it again to get some distance. Thank God. I didn't even signal. I just cut across 2 lanes and flew down the ramp. As soon as I merged onto the well-lit interstate with other cars and trucks around, the pickup truck hung back. It stayed about a quarter mile behind me for another exit or 2, then suddenly veered off onto an exit ramp and disappeared back into the dark. I drove the rest of the way home in total silence, white-knuckling the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I pulled into my parents' driveway as the sun was coming up. I never found out who that guy was or what he wanted, but the way he grabbed my door handle and that smile when he tried to run me off the road, I know he wasn't just trying to scare me. If I hadn't gotten onto that interstate, I don't think I would have made it home that night. I've been working security for about 5 years now, mostly in corporate office buildings or construction sites. The gigs are usually pretty dull, just checking locks, doing patrols, and shooing away the occasional teenager. But last year, I picked up this graveyard shift at the university library, and that job, well, let's just say it's the reason I don't work nights anymore. The library is this massive, brutalist concrete building from the 70s. It has 6 floors, but the bottom 2 are what we call the stacks. It's where they keep the old periodicals, the government documents, and the books that nobody's checked out in decades. It's a maze of metal shelving units that run floor to ceiling, packed so tight you have to turn sideways to squeeze through some of the aisles. The shift was usually quiet. I'd sit at the front desk on the main floor, monitor the cameras, and do a patrol every 2 hours. This happened on a Tuesday night in November. The university was on fall break, so the campus was dead. I was the only person in the entire building. At around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the desk, scrolling on my phone when the motion sensor panel beeped. It was triggering in the lower level 2 stacks, the deepest, darkest part of the basement. I looked at the camera monitor for that sector. The feed was grainy and black and white, showing just endless rows of shelves. I didn't see anyone. I figured it was the HVAC system kicking on and blowing a loose paper around that triggered the motion sensor. It happens sometimes, but per protocol, I had to go clear it. So I grabbed my flashlight and the keys and took the elevator down. When the doors opened on level 2, the air hit me first. It smells different down there, like dust, decaying paper, and something metallic. The lights are on motion sensors, so the floor was pitch black, stretching out in front of me. As I stepped off the elevator, the banks of fluorescent lights flickered on, one by one, creating this domino-like effect of illumination down the main corridor. I walked toward the sector that had triggered the alarm. It was the J section, mostly oversized atlases and old maps. When I turned the corner into the aisle, I stopped. Lying on the floor, right in the center of the aisle, was this large book. It was lying there like someone had been reading it and just dropped it. My stomach tightened. I knew for a fact that the cleaning crew had swept this floor at 10 p.m. and that book hadn't been there then. I walked over, picked it up, and shoved it back onto the shelf. I called out, announcing that I was security and that the building was closed. My voice just died in the silence though, swallowed up by the thousands of books. I stood there for a minute, listening. I heard the low hum of the ventilation, the buzzing of a dying light bulb, and then I heard something else. It was a soft, sliding sound like someone was dragging their foot across the carpet, and it came from the next aisle over, aisle K. I stepped out to the end of the row and shone my flashlight down aisle K. It was empty, just rows of books. I told myself it was just the building settling and did a quick sweep of the immediate area, checking the ends of the rows. I didn't find anyone, and I was feeling pretty creeped out, to be honest, so I decided to head back to the elevator. As I was walking back down the main corridor though, I got that feeling. You know the one. The prickly heat on the back of your neck that tells you something is hunting you. So I stopped walking. The silence behind me was heavy. I spun around, sweeping the light back the way I came. Nothing but concrete and metal. I turned back around and kept walking, faster this time. Then I heard a scuff. I froze again. I definitely heard it that time. It was a footstep, and it was close. I whipped around again, shouting for whoever was out there to come out. I waited for a full minute, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. Just silence. I practically jogged the rest of the way back to the elevator. I mashed the button, and when the doors closed, I finally let out a breath. I got back to the security desk and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake it. I pulled up the camera feeds again, determined to find an explanation. Maybe it was a rat or something else. I don't know. I cycled through the cameras. Level 1, clear. Main floor, clear. I got to level 2. The camera covers the main corridor where the elevator is. I watched the footage from a few minutes ago, the recording of me doing my patrol. I saw myself step off the elevator. I saw myself walk down the corridor and turn into aisle J. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the video, about 10 seconds after I walked into aisle J, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete support pillar near the elevator. Whoever it was must have been standing there the entire time I was coming down the hall. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes, and appeared to be barefoot. I watched on the screen as the figure crept down the hallway, following me. It moved strangely, with these kind of jerky motions, and it kept really low to the ground. When I turned into aisle J and found the book, the figure stopped at the end of the aisle, peeking around the corner, watching me. Then the video showed me coming out of aisle J and to check aisle K. As I stepped out to look down aisle K, the figure didn't run away, he didn't hide, he simply just stepped into aisle J, the one that I'd just vacated. We'd essentially swapped spots. He was standing where I was, and I was standing where he was. The video continued. I saw myself walking back toward the elevator. I saw myself stop. This must have been when I heard the noise. On the screen, the figure was walking maybe 10 feet behind me. When I stopped, the figure stopped. When I spun around to check behind me with the flashlight, the figure ducked out of sight into one of the aisles. When I turned back around to walk to the elevator, the figure came back out again and continued to follow me, right up until the moment the elevator doors closed. The video ended with the elevator doors shutting. The figure stood there for a moment, staring at the closed doors. He just stood there staring for like a solid 10 seconds before walking calmly away, back into the darkness. I called the police immediately. They searched the building floor to ceiling. They found a sleeping bag stashed behind a ventilation unit in the mechanical room, along with some food wrappers, but they never found the guy. I quit the next morning. Needless to say, I was never gonna go back there again. The drought had turned the cornfield into a sea of rattling bones. It was a dry, windless night in mid-November. It held the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was pushing against your eardrums. I was alone in my grandfather's farmhouse, tasked with packing up the last of his belongings before the estate sale. The only thing visible from the kitchen window was the scarecrow. Granddad had built it years ago, a crude thing, stuffed with straw and dressed in a moth-eaten flannel shirt and oversized denim overalls. A burlap sack served as its head, with 2 jagged holes cut out for eyes. I was taping up a box of old almanacs when I heard it, a dry, rhythmic, dragging sound like a swish followed by a thump, and it was coming from the yard. It sounded like someone dragging a bale of hay through the dirt and then setting it down. I went to the back porch and flipped on the floodlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dry rows of corn. The wooden post where the scarecrow usually hung was empty. The crossbar remained, looking like a crucifix against the black sky. But the figure was gone. "Kids," I muttered, assuming the local teenagers were trying to mess with me. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped off the porch. The air smelled of ozone and dry rot. I found the scarecrow about 20 feet away, lying face down in the dirt between 2 corn rows. It looked like it had been torn down violently. I grabbed the back of the flannel shirt to haul it back to the shed. I expected it to be light, just dry straw and cloth, But it was incredibly heavy. It felt like less of a bundle of hay and more like dead weight, dense and limp. I dragged it across the yard, the heels of its boots digging trenches in the dust. I managed to prop it up against the side of the barn, intending to deal with it in the morning. When I walked back to the house, I wiped my hands on my jeans. They felt greasy, like they were coated in some strange, slick residue that hadn't been on the flannel. Back inside, I locked the door and returned to the kitchen. I tried focusing on the packing, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. 10 minutes later, the sound returned. The dragging, swish, thump, swish, thump. The sound slowly made its way onto the porch steps. Swish, thump. I froze, the packing tape gun trembling in my hand. There was no way a prankster would be bold enough to walk right up to the door, I thought to myself. I moved to the hallway, staying out of the line of sight of the door's frosted glass window. A shadow fell across the floorboards, blocking out the porch light. Something was standing directly against the door. "Who's there?" I called out. I'm embarrassed to say my voice cracked. There was no answer, just a soft, wet sound, like a sponge being squeezed against the glass. I crept closer, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. I lunged forward and yanked the curtain aside. The scarecrow was pressed right up against the glass. But it wasn't just leaning, its burlap face was like mashed against the window pane. The jagged eye holes, which should have been black voids in the straw, appeared wet. I swear I saw them glistening in the light. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched, paralyzed, as the flannel chest of the scarecrow rose and fell. It looked like it was breathing. I scrambled to check the deadbolt, my fingers fumbling. It was locked, thank God. Suddenly, the scarecrow shifted. It didn't move like a person, it moved with a jerky, almost hydraulic kind of stiffness, and it raised a gloved hand and placed it against the doorknob. The doorknob shifted, not with a frantic jiggle, but a slow turn, like as if the door was being tested. I didn't wait to see if the lock would hold. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed my car keys, and bolted out the side door. I sprinted toward my truck, not daring to look back at the porch. I fumbled the key into the ignition and roared the engine to life. As the headlights swept across the yard, I saw it one last time. The scarecrow wasn't on the porch anymore. It was standing in the middle of the driveway, blocking my exit. It stood perfectly upright, arms spread wide as if inviting me in for a hug. I slammed my foot on the gas. I didn't care. I was gonna run it down. The truck hit the figure with a sickening, meaty crunch. It didn't explode into straw like an ordinary scarecrow would have, I thought. Instead, it sounded like I'd hit a deer. The truck shuddered, rolling over the mass, and I sped onto the main road, not stopping until I was 10 miles away at an all-night gas station. The police went out the next morning to check the property. They found nothing. The scarecrow was back on its post in the cornfield, hanging limp and lifeless. That night still haunts me to this day. So this happened about 2 years ago when I was renting this older ranch-style house out in the suburbs. It was a decent place in a nice neighborhood, or so I thought. But the house itself had this weird quirk. The living room had these big picture windows that faced right out onto the front lawn and the street beyond. And when I moved in, there weren't any blinds or curtains on them. The landlord said the previous tenants had taken them. I was living alone, working late hours, and I just never got around to going to Home Depot to, measure things out and buy new ones. At night, if I had the lights on in the living room, the whole world could see inside, and I couldn't see a thing out. But it really wasn't an issue for the first few months. I mean, it took some getting used to, but you do just kind of get used to the exposure over time, I guess. Until this one night. It was a Tuesday, late, probably just past 1:30 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I was just sitting on the couch in the living room, just mindlessly scrolling through my phone with the TV on low in the background. The house was dead quiet otherwise. Then I heard this noise. It was very distinct. This tap, tap, tapping. It came right from the big picture window behind the couch. I froze. My brain immediately tried to explain it, thinking maybe it was a large moth hitting the glass or maybe a branch, even though there were no trees close enough to the house to do that. I sat there, perfectly still, listening. A few seconds passed and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. And then it happened again, only louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. That wasn't any animal or act of nature. That was knuckles on glass, I thought to myself, as my stomach just dropped. The terrifying thing about those windows at night is that they turn into black mirrors. I was sitting in a brightly lit fishbowl, essentially, and whoever was out there was standing in total darkness. I slowly put my phone down on the cushion and stood up and took a couple of steps towards the window, straining my eyes to see through my reflection in the glass. At first, I couldn't see anything but the living room reflected back at me, but then I shifted my angle, looking toward the edge of the window frame, and my blood ran cold. There was a shape right there on the porch. It was just a dense shadow against the lesser darkness of the lawn, but it was definitely there and human-sized, and it was moving slowly away from the glass toward the front door. I didn't wait to see more. I backed out of the living room into the hallway, out of line of sight of those awful, uncovered windows. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. I got through to the dispatcher and tried to keep my voice down. I told her someone was knocking on my windows and prowling around my porch. She asked if I could get a description and I told her no, explaining that I couldn't see out because of the lights, but they could definitely see in. Saying that out loud to the operator made me realize how stupid and vulnerable I'd been, leaving those windows bare. She told me she had officers on the way and to go lock myself in an interior room if I could. I ran to the bathroom in the back hallway. It was the only room in the house with a lock on the door, and crucially, no windows. I slammed the door, twisted the cheap little privacy lock, and turned off the light. I practically dove into the bathtub and curled up into a ball, clutching my phone to my chest. It was pitch black in there. I just sat shivering in the empty tub, straining my ears. For about 30 seconds there was silence, and then the whole house shook with this violent boom. They were kicking the front door. I could hear the wood groaning under the impact. The kicking continued. Boom, boom. I heard muffled shouting from outside between the kicks. They sounded angry. I squeezed my eyes shut in the dark bathroom, just praying that the deadbolt on the front door would hold. Every time another boom echoed through the house, I flinched. I knew that if they got through that door, it would only take them seconds to check the bedrooms and find the locked bathroom door. It felt like an eternity just sitting there in the dark, waiting for the sound of splintering wood, and then suddenly, I hear sirens in the distance. They started faint but got loud fast. The kicking stopped instantly. I heard heavy footsteps pounding on the front porch, but they were running away from the house this time. I heard car doors slamming somewhere out on the street, tires screeching, and then just the overwhelming sound of sirens arriving outside my house. I didn't move from the tub until I heard the police radio chatter right outside the bathroom door and a cop announcing himself. They didn't catch the guys. By the time the first cruiser pulled up, they were gone. The police found deep boot marks on the front door. The deadbolt had barely held on. I moved out of that house the next day. I still can't stand being in a room at night where the windows are uncovered. I just keep thinking about those first taps on the window. How long had they been out there, watching me, before they decided to let me know they were there? So this happened last winter, just a few months after I moved into a townhouse complex on the outskirts of the city. It was mostly quiet with a lot of young professionals and families, the kind of place where people keep to themselves, but you'd still get a friendly wave if you were taking out the trash. I've always been a bit of a night owl, staying up way too late watching YouTube or scrolling through social media, which is exactly what I was doing on the night this happened. It was around 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was lying on the couch in the living room, which is on the ground floor of my unit. The layout is pretty standard. Living room in the front, kitchen in the back, and a sliding glass door off the kitchen that leads to a small patio. I had the TV on low for background noise, and the only lights on were the ones from the kitchen and the blue glow of my phone screen. I was deep into a rabbit hole of random videos when a notification popped up at the top of my screen. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a second, kind of confused. It was just blank, like just an empty message. My first thought was that it was some kind of a glitch with the towers maybe, I don't know. So I closed the message and went back to scrolling. About 2 minutes later, another message from the same number. This time, I felt a little prickle of annoyance. I opened the message and a photo filled my screen. My stomach dropped. It was a picture of my front door, taken that night. I could see the specific wreath I'd hung up for the winter and the small chip in the paint near the handle. The lighting was poor, clearly taken with a flash in the dark. The timestamp on the photo said, "Today, 1:04 a.m." That was about a minute ago. I sat there frozen, my thumb hovering over the screen. I immediately jumped off the couch and ran to the front window. I peered through the blinds, trying to see if anyone was on the porch or the sidewalk. The street was empty. The streetlights were humming, casting long orange shadows on the pavement, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I checked the deadbolt on the front door, and it was locked. I'd locked it when I got home from work. I went back to the couch, my heart rate starting to climb. I told myself it was probably just a prank, maybe some teenagers just trying to freak me out. I sat back down but didn't go back to scrolling on my phone. I just held it in my hand, staring at the blank screen. I was listening now. The house suddenly felt way too big and way too quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I could hear the wind rattling the siding outside. Then the screen lit up again. Another message. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't want to look, I really didn't, but I needed to know what it was. If they were still out front, I was going to call the cops. I opened the message. The image loaded. It wasn't the front door this time. It was the back of my house. Specifically, it was a picture of my patio taken from the darkness of the backyard. I could see the sliding glass door, and through the glass I could see the blurry, illuminated shape of my kitchen. But the thing that made my blood run cold was that the sliding door in the picture was cracked open about 2 inches. I sprinted into the kitchen. I looked at the slider, and it was open. Just a crack. I must have left it open when I let some fresh air in earlier that evening while I was cooking. I slammed the door shut and threw the latch. I grabbed the wooden dowel I kept in the track and jammed it into place. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, staring out into the blank void of the backyard. I couldn't see anything past the reflection of the kitchen lights on the glass. Another message notification popped up. With shaking hands, I opened the message. The image loaded. It was a picture of me. It was taken from behind. I was standing in the kitchen, facing the sliding glass door, slamming it shut. The picture had been taken from the hallway leading to the living room. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as I dialed 911. The operator came on the line. She asked me what my emergency was. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The person wasn't outside. They hadn't been outside for the last photo. They were in the living room, or the hallway. I was in the kitchen, so the only way out was through the living room to the front door, or through the sliding door I'd just locked. I whispered into the phone that there was someone in my house. I told her they were sending me pictures of myself. The operator told me to lock myself in a room immediately. I looked toward the hallway, and it was dark. The living room TV cast flickering shadows against the walls. I didn't see anyone, but there were so many places to hide. The coat closet, the space behind the couch, the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. So I didn't go to a room, I just stayed put. I was too scared to turn my back on the hallway. Instead, I grabbed a kitchen knife from the block on the counter. A pathetic defense, I know, but better than nothing. I backed myself into the corner of the kitchen, putting the island between me and the dark opening of the hallway. I stayed on the line with the operator. She kept telling me officers were on the way, that they were 2 minutes out. It felt like 2 hours. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every shift of the ice maker made me jump. When the police arrived, they came through the front door. I heard them shouting, clearing the rooms. When they finally came into the kitchen and told me to put the knife down, I nearly collapsed from relief. They searched the place top to bottom. They checked the attic, the closets, under the beds. They found no one. but they did find something. In the living room, behind the heavy curtains on the front window, they found a small impression in the carpet. Someone had been standing there, and on the windowsill, there was a faint, muddy smudge from a shoe. The police figured the guy had slipped through the unlocked back door earlier in the night while I was distracted on the couch. He'd probably been in the house for over an hour before he sent the first photo. I moved out the next weekend. I broke my lease, paid the fees, and got a place on the 4th floor of a secure building. And every time I get a notification on my phone late at night, I still feel that same cold drop in my stomach. This happened a long time ago, back when I was in the 4th grade, so forgive me if the details are a bit fuzzy. I grew up in a really rural area, the kind of place where houses are miles apart and surrounded by nothing but thick woods and winding back roads. Because of how far out we lived, my bus stop was actually at the end of our long gravel driveway, right where it met the main road. It was pretty spooky in the mornings, especially in the winter when the sun hadn't fully come up yet. I remember my mum would usually wait with me, but she had just started this new job that required her to leave early, so for the first time in my life, I was responsible for getting myself on the bus alone. I was the last stop on the route before the bus headed to the school, which meant 2 things. 1, the bus was always packed with kids by the time it got to me. And 2, the bus driver, an older lady named Mrs. Higgins, who had been driving since my dad was in school, was usually running a few minutes late. This specific morning was foggy. I remember kicking rocks around the end of the driveway, just trying to keep warm in my jacket. I didn't have a phone back then. Most kids my age didn't, so I was just staring down the empty road, listening for the familiar groan of the diesel engine. After about 10 minutes of waiting, I saw headlights cutting through the fog. I grabbed my backpack, assuming it was Mrs. Higgins, but as the headlights got closer, I realized something was off. The engine didn't sound right. It didn't have that deep, rattling chug that I was used to. It sounded smoother, almost like a large van. When the bus finally pulled up in front of me, my stomach immediately dropped. It was a yellow school bus, but it looked different. It was older, much dirtier than the one I rode every day. The black paint on the rub rails was peeling and the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside at all. There was no school district number printed on the side, just a weird blank yellow expanse where the district name usually was. The door creaked open and that was when the red flags really started waving in my head. The driver wasn't Mrs. Higgins. It was a man I'd never seen before. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low, and he had this really strained, tight smile plastered on his face. He looked at me and told me to hop on. I stayed planted right where I was. I remember glancing up at the windows again, trying to see if any of my friends were in there, but it was just pitch black behind the glass. Plus, it was dead silent. Usually, even with the windows up, you could hear the hum of 30 kids talking or laughing. This bus was silent as a grave. I asked him where Mrs. Higgins was. The driver didn't miss a beat. He told me that Mrs. Higgins was out sick today and that he was the substitute covering her route. He gestured with his hand for me to come up the stairs, acting like he was in a hurry, but something about it just felt wrong. I asked him why the bus was empty. This was the main thing that bothered me. Since I was the last stop, the bus should have been full, and there was no reason for it to be empty unless he skipped every single stop before mine. His smile faltered for a second, just a tiny twitch in his cheek, before he recovered. He explained that there had been a mix-up at the dispatch and he was running the route in reversed order today. He said he was picking me up first, then going to get the other kids. That made zero sense. If he was running it in reverse, he would have started at the school and worked his way out. If he was picking me up first, why was he 20 minutes late? And why didn't he come from the direction of the school? I told him that I thought I should go back inside and call my dad just to make sure. It was a lie, my dad was already at work, but I just wanted an excuse to get away from the open door of that bus. The driver's demeanor changed instantly. The fake smile dropped completely, replaced by a look of sheer annoyance. He leaned forward in his seat, gripping the large steering wheel tight. He told me that he didn't have time for me to run back to the house. He said he was already behind schedule and that if I didn't get on right now, he was going to leave me and I'd be in trouble for missing school. He was trying to use that authoritative voice, the kind that makes a kid feel small and obedient, but it just made my fight or flight response kick in hard. I took a step back up the driveway, shaking my head. I told him I wasn't getting on. He stared at me for what felt like a long time. His eyes were scanning the area behind me, looking up the long driveway toward my house, probably checking to see if someone was watching. It was just us. The road was empty. The fog was thick. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to get out of the seat. I saw him shift his weight, and his hand moved toward the lever that opened the door. He looked like he was bracing himself to stand up. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was ready to bolt into the woods the second his foot hit the pavement. I knew the woods better than anyone. I knew I could lose him in the trees. But then a car came around the bend down the road. It was just a neighbor passing by, but the headlights swept over the bus. The driver flinched. He looked at the oncoming car, then looked back at me with a glare that I still see in my nightmares. He didn't say anything else. He just yanked the lever, slamming the bus door shut. He gunned the engine and peeled out, tires screeching on the pavement as he took off down the road, disappearing into the fog. I stood there shaking for a solid 5 minutes. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified that if I went back inside, he might come back, or that maybe I really had just missed the bus and gotten a substitute driver in trouble. Then about 10 minutes later, I heard a familiar sound, the chugging, rhythmic clatter of a diesel engine. Mrs. Higgins' bus came rolling out of the fog, and it was the same bus number I rode every day. I could see the heads of kids bouncing around inside the clear windows. When she opened the door, the noise of the other students flooded out. It was the most comforting sound I'd ever heard. I got on, and Mrs. Higgins gave me a weird look. She asked me why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't really know how to explain it in the moment, so I just mumbled something about being cold and went to my seat. I sat there the whole ride to school looking out the window, expecting to see that strange, unmarked yellow bus pulled over on the side of the road, waiting, but I never saw it. When I got home that afternoon, my mum was there. She asked me how my day was, and I told her it was fine, but then I mentioned the first bus. I told her about the man, the empty seats, and how he got angry when I wouldn't get on. I watched the color drain out of her face. She made me repeat the story 3 times, then she called the school immediately, and I sat at the kitchen table listening to her side of the conversation. I heard her voice go from confused to panic. It turned out that there was no substitute driver, and most importantly, the school district didn't have any buses that looked like the one I described, and they certainly didn't have any drivers fitting that man's description. The school called the police. An officer came to our house that evening and took a statement from me. He was really nice, but he was serious. He asked me about the peeling paint, the tinted windows, and the driver's hat. I found out later that they sent out an alert to all the parents in the district. Apparently I wasn't the only kid who'd seen this bus, but I was the only one he'd actually stopped for. Another kid a few miles over had seen the bus idling near a park, but it drove off when a parent walked outside. The scariest part wasn't until a few weeks later. My parents sat me down and told me that the police had found an old, decommissioned school bus abandoned in a scrapyard about 20 miles away. It had been crudely painted yellow over an old church logo, and the windows had been spray painted black from the inside. They found zip ties and duct tape under the seats. I think about that morning a lot. I think about how easy it would have been to just listen to an adult, to just follow the routine and step onto the bus, because I didn't want to be late for school. I think about what would have happened if that neighbor hadn't driven by at that exact second. But mostly, I think about the fact that he knew I was the last stop. He knew exactly where to be and exactly when to be there to catch me alone. And that means he'd been watching me for a long time before he finally made his move. I was driving home from college for spring break when this happened. It's a drive I've done probably 20 times. About 4 hours of mostly nothing but cornfields and long stretches of highway that separate the university town from the suburbs where my parents live. I usually try to leave in the afternoon to beat the dark, but I had a late lab that ran overtime, so I didn't get on the road until almost 8 p.m. By the time I hit the rural stretch of Route 41, it was pitch black, and I mean that heavy, suffocating country darkness where the only light comes from your high beams cutting through the fog. I was listening to a podcast, trying to keep my eyes focused on the road, when I saw hazard lights flashing on the shoulder up ahead. As I got closer, I saw a silver sedan, maybe a mid-2000s Honda. The hood wasn't up, but the car was parked at a weird angle like they'd swerved off the road in a hurry. Standing by the trunk was a girl. She looked young, maybe my age, or even younger, perhaps. She was wearing a thin hoodie and jeans. She waved her arms frantically as I approached. Now, I'm no hero, but I was raised to be helpful. If I see someone stranded, especially a girl alone at night, my instinct is to stop. But something about the way the car was parked just gave me this weird feeling in my gut. My dad always told me that if my gut says no, I should listen, even if it seems rude. So instead of pulling over right behind her, I slowed down to a crawl and rolled my passenger window down just a crack, maybe 2 inches. I kept my foot on the brake and the car in drive. She ran up to the window immediately. She looked terrified. Her mascara was smeared like she'd been crying, and she was shivering. She started pleading through the crack in the window, her voice muffled but frantic. She said her car had died and her phone was dead, and she just needed a ride to the gas station at the next exit, which was about 10 miles up. I looked at her, then I looked at the dark road behind us, and there was nobody else around. I told her I couldn't give her a ride, but I had a charger in my car and I could call AAA or the police for her. Her demeanor changed instantly. She stopped shivering. She leaned in closer to the glass, pressing her face against it, and told me that she didn't want the police. She said she just needed to get in the car right now because she was freezing. She reached for the door handle and yanked it. Thankfully, my car doors were locked. The sound of the handle clicking locked me into a panic. I told her I was calling 911 right now and that they would help her. As soon as I said 911, she screamed at me. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was pure rage. She slammed her fist against my window and cursed at me, calling me every name in the book. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I hit the gas and peeled out of there, gravel spraying up from the shoulder. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I watched the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there in the red glow of my taillights, but the darkness swallowed her up almost instantly. I drove for about 10 minutes in total silence, the podcast forgotten. I was shaking, trying to process the switch from damsel in distress to psycho in 3 seconds flat. I convinced myself she was probably on drugs or having some kind of mental breakdown. I felt guilty for leaving her, but scared enough that I knew I made the right call. I was just starting to calm down when headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It's a highway, cars exist. But these lights were coming up fast, way faster than the speed limit. They got right up on my bumper, blinding me with their high beams. I tapped my brakes to signal them to back off or pass, but they stayed glued to me. I moved into the slow lane. They moved with me. I squinted at the rearview mirror, trying to make out the car through the glare. It was a silver sedan. A chill ran through me. It was the Honda, the car that had supposedly died 10 miles back. I floored it. My old Ford Focus wasn't exactly a race car, but I pushed it to 80, then 90. The silver car matched me effortlessly. We were the only two cars on the road, tearing through the darkness. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the signal in this part of the state is notorious for being dead. 1 bar, no service. I saw a sign for a rest area coming up in 2 miles. I debated pulling in. If there were truckers there or security, I'd be safe, but if it was empty, then I'd be trapping myself. I decided to skip it and aim for the next town, which was still 20 minutes away. The car behind me surged forward and pulled into the left lane, pulling up alongside me. I refused to look over. I just stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I expected them to sideswipe me or try to run me off the road, but they didn't. They just drove next to me for what felt like an eternity, matching my speed perfectly. Then they suddenly braked hard, dropping back behind me, and took the exit for the rest area I'd just passed. I watched their taillights fade down the off-ramp. I didn't slow down. I kept going at 90 miles an hour until I hit the city limits of the next town. I pulled up to a brightly lit 24-hour gas station, ran inside, and locked myself in the bathroom. I finally had service, so I called the police and told them everything. The girl, the aggressive driving, the pursuit. A state trooper came out to meet me. I gave a statement, but he basically told me that without a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do except patrol the area. He said that it was likely an attempted carjacking and that I was lucky I didn't unlock the door. I eventually drove the rest of the way home, eyes glued to the mirrors, but I never saw the silver car again. When I got to my parents' house, I was exhausted. I parked in the driveway and just sat there for a minute, letting the adrenaline crash wash over me. I decided to pull the SD card from my dash cam. I'd bought a cheap front and rear dash cam off Amazon a few months prior, mostly for insurance reasons, but I wanted to see if I had caught the license plate when the car pulled up alongside me. I went inside, plugged the card into my laptop, and pulled up the footage. I scrubbed through the video until I found the timestamp for when I stopped on the shoulder. The front camera showed exactly what I remembered. The girl waving, running up to the window, the frantic conversation. Then I switched to the rear-facing camera view. The quality was grainy because of the low light, but the reverse lights of my car illuminated the scene just enough. I watched my car slow down. I saw the girl run toward the front passenger window, but as she was running toward the front, the passenger door of their supposedly broken down silver Honda opened. A man crawled out. He was dressed all in black. He didn't stand up, he stayed low, crouching below the window line of my car. While the girl was distracting me at the front window, crying and begging for a ride, the man was crab walking toward my back passenger door. In the video, I could see him reach for my back door handle at the same moment the girl reached for the front one. He pulled on it gently, trying to be silent. If I'd hit the unlock button, if I'd been just a little more trusting, or if I tried to let her in, he would have slipped into the back seat before I even knew he was there. I still drive that route back to school, but I never drive it at night anymore. And if I see a car broken down on the side of the road, I don't even tap the brakes. I just keep driving. So this happened about 2 years ago, back when I was working as a junior graphic designer for this marketing agency downtown. Our office was on the 14th floor of an old high-rise, one of those places with heavy brass elevators and a lobby that always smelled like floor wax. It was late October, and I was pulling an all-nighter to finish a holiday campaign. By 10:30 p.m., the office was completely dead. We had an open floor plan, which meant the entire level was just a sea of empty cubicles, and the building used these motion sensor lights to save energy, so while my section, the creative section, was lit up, the rest of the floor was pitch black. So I was just sitting there doing my work, zoning out to a podcast, when I realized I needed some water. I took my headphones off and the silence, it hit me instantly. It was this heavy, kind of like silence you only get in big buildings when the AC shuts off and no one else is around. I walked to the break room, grabbed a drink, and was heading back to my desk when I heard it. A click, clack, click. It was the sound of typing coming from the sales department section, which was all the way across the floor in the dark. I froze. I could swear for a fact that I was the only one left on the floor. I'd watched the last account manager leave hours ago. I told myself it was maybe just the building or maybe the ice maker in the fridge, but then it happened again. Click, clack, click. It sounded like an old mechanical keyboard, you know, the kind that makes those really loud, tactile noises. And so I called out, asking if anyone was there. My voice echoed across the room, but nobody answered. No chair squeaks, no signs of movement whatsoever, just dead air. So I went back to my desk and put my headphones on, but I just couldn't focus. I kept glancing over the top of my monitor toward the dark abyss of the sales department. About 20 minutes later, the motion lights in the sales section suddenly flickered on. A wave of dread washed over me. Those sensors needed a human-sized object moving across the room to trigger. I stared at the lit-up section, but it was empty. Just rows of grey cubicles. Then the typing started again, but this time, it was aggressive. Clack, clack, clack. It sounded like someone was angry typing, just like furiously hammering away at the keys. It was violent enough that I could hear it clearly from almost 50 yards away. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I started walking toward the sales department, telling myself it had to be, I don't know, a computer glitch or maybe a cleaning crew member I hadn't seen. As I got closer, the typing continued, getting louder and louder. I reached the edge of the sales floor, and the sound was coming from the back corner office. I walked down the aisle, my heart pounding in my throat. I called out again, asking who was there. The typing stopped instantly. I reached the back row and looked around the corner of the cubicle where the sound had come from, and it was empty. The monitor was black, the keyboard was just sitting there, untouched. There was no one under the desk or hiding in the corner. I felt like I was losing my mind. I touched the keyboard, it was cold. I touched the computer, and that was cold too, like it hadn't been turned on or used for hours. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on that corner, and I decided that I was just done with it. So I turned around and speed-walked back toward my desk to pack up and go home. As I passed the break room, the elevator dinged and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The doors slid open and Marcus, the night janitor, walked out with his trash cart. I let out a huge breath of relief. Marcus took his headphones out and asked me what I was doing there so late. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I just told him the building was making some weird noises and I was heading out. Marcus laughed and said old buildings always make noise. He said he was just going to empty the trash bins in sales and then he'd head down too. He started pushing his cart toward the sales department, the area I'd just come from. I went to my desk and started shoving my laptop into my bag. I just wanted to get out of there. I was zipping up my bag when I heard Marcus stop moving. The squeaky wheels of his cart just halted abruptly. Then I heard him yell, asking who was there. I ran out from behind my desk. Marcus was standing in the middle of the aisle, staring intently at the back corner I just investigated. And he didn't look at me, he just kept staring at the dark corner. He pointed a shaking finger and told me someone had just stood up from behind the cubicle, looked at him, and then ducked back down. And then the typing started again. But it wasn't just typing this time, it was smashing. Bam, bam, bam. It sounded like someone was taking their fists and smashing them repeatedly against a desk. Marcus abandoned his cart immediately. He turned around and started running toward me, his eyes wide with a genuine terror. I told him we needed to go right now. We hit the stairwell door and sprinted down 14 flights of stairs. I don't think either of us breathed until we hit the lobby. We burst out of the front doors onto the street. Marcus refused to go back up to finish his shift. He called a supervisor from the sidewalk and made up an excuse about a family emergency. I went back the next day in broad daylight to check that back cubicle, and what I found still messes with me to this day. The keyboard was fine, but the monitor was covered in kind of like greasy, oily handprints. It looked like someone had pressed their hands flat against the monitor over and over again, leaving hundreds of these frantic, overlapping prints. Then I went to my own desk. My ergonomic keyboard, which I'd left perfectly straight, was split in half. It was snapped right down the middle like someone had brought a sledgehammer down on it. The security logs showed that nobody had entered or exited the floor between the time we ran out and the time the first employee arrived the next morning. Whatever smashed my keyboard was locked in there with it all night. I quit about 2 months later because I just couldn't handle the anxiety of being there after dark anymore. Back in 2019, I was taking a gap year and living with my uncle in a tiny town in rural Ohio. To save money for college, I took the only job I could find, the graveyard shift at a place called Miller's Stop. It was this rundown independent gas station on a lonely state highway, surrounded by miles of cornfields. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The owner was this old grumpy guy who basically handed me the keys and told me that if I fell asleep, I was fired. For the first few hours of my shift, we'd get the occasional trucker, but after 2 a.m. the place was just a ghost town. It was just me, the hum of the slushy machine, and the darkness outside. Now the layout of the place is kind of important to this story, so keep it in mind. I stood behind a counter in what was essentially a glass box. Off to the far right of the lot, in the dark where the pavement turned to gravel, there was an old air pump. It had one of those black rubber hoses that snakes across the ground, and whenever a car drove over it, a bell would ring inside the store. The first couple of weeks were boring. Then on a Tuesday at around 3:30 a.m., ding ding, I hear the bell ring. I looked up, expecting to see a car, but the lot was empty. The pumps were lit up by LEDs, but the air pump area was dark. 10 minutes later, the bell rang again. I looked up, still nothing. When I told the owner about this the next day, he waved it off. He said the cold weather made the rubber of the air pump's hose stiff, which could trigger the bell. Either that or it was just animals. So I learned to ignore it. Every night at around 3 a.m., the bell would ring, and it just became background noise. Fast forward to mid-November. It was a windy night and the corn had been harvested, leaving just acres of dead stubble. At around 3 a.m., once again, the bell went off. I didn't even look up from the receipt printer I was fixing. But then it went off again, almost immediately. Ding ding, and then again, and again. This wasn't random. There seemed to be a pattern, like someone was jumping on the hose maybe. I finally looked up, and the lot was empty. I walked out from behind the counter and approached the front glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the glare. The ringing stopped the moment I got close to the window. The motion light over the air pump was broken, so that corner was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I had a heavy, sick feeling that I was being watched. I went to the back office to check the security cameras. We had a monitor that cycled through 4 grainy black and white feeds. I froze the screen on camera 3, and my heart just sank. There was a person, this guy, just lying face down on the pavement next to the hose. They were dressed in dark clothes, blending in with the road. As I watched, the figure moved, but they didn't stand up. They dragged themselves forward like a snake, sliding across the ground until their hand reached out and pressed down on the hose. Ding ding, the bell echoed in the front of the store. Then the figure stopped moving. Slowly, they tilted their head back until they were looking directly up at the camera lens. The resolution was terrible, but I could see their eyes glowing white in the infrared light, and I could see a wide grin on their face. I got the sense they knew I was watching. I stumbled back, scrambling for my phone to call 911. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Then I hear a ring, but not the ring of the air pump's bell. It was the chime of the front door sensor. Someone had just walked into the store. I was in the back office and there was no back exit. I slammed the office door shut and locked the deadbolt. I backed into the corner, grabbing a heavy metal stapler from the desk, and I listened. I heard the wet squeak of sneakers on the floor, really slow, like deliberate steps. The footsteps stopped right outside the office door. Then I hear a man's voice from the other side. It wasn't shouting, it was calm, almost conversational. "I have a flat tire," he said. "I need some help with the air pump." He sounded like a regular guy, which just somehow made things worse. I didn't answer. The doorknob jiggled, gently at first, then harder. Then the knob stopped moving, and silence fell over the store. I waited for minutes that felt like hours. Finally, the front door chime rang again. The guy had left. I stayed in that office until I saw the blue and red lights of a police cruiser on the monitor. When I came out, the store was empty. The police reviewed the footage. They saw the guy crawling on the ground. They saw him look up at the camera. They saw him enter the store. But here's the part that really made my skin crawl. On the tape, when the guy enters the store, he doesn't just go straight to the office. Instead, he walked behind the counter first and just stood there for like a solid minute, just staring at the magazine and open energy drink I'd left there. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled something out, and placed it on the counter. The officer went to the counter and picked it up with a gloved hand and showed it to me. It was a Polaroid photo. It was grainy and taken at night with a flash. It showed the back of a house, zooming in on a lit window. Inside the window, you could clearly see a figure sitting at the desk, studying. It was me. The photo was of my bedroom window at my uncle's house. I quit my job and moved out that day and went back to my parents' place 3 states away. I don't work night shifts anymore.